So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank Ricki Sabia, Senior Education Policy Advisor for the National Down Syndrome Congress. And without further ado, Ricki, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. And again, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this very important information for families in states, because as you will see, a lot is at stake with this law in terms of your child's education. So a little bit of background, because it gets very complicated. What is this ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act? Well, it's actually a reauthorization, an amendment of a law that's been around since 1965, which is called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. And every time they reauthorize or amend it, they give it a new nickname, and that's what you're hearing. Every Student Succeeds Act is now the current nickname for the law that was signed this past December. So ESEA was also amended by the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002 and the Every Student Succeeds Act in December 2015 is what we're talking about now. All along, the purpose of Title I of ESSA is to provide all children with the opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. This is the most important thing for you to know, because this is why ESSA is so important to our kids. And, you know, I've been working in this field since before No Child Left Behind, and I've tried to make this point over the years, and it's really hard because we're very wedded to IDEA, as we should be. It's a very important law for our children, and I say our children because I have a 24-year-old son with Down syndrome. But ESSA is the law that changes the system, that allows us to advocate for certain things, because as we all know, if our system is not doing what it's supposed to do, then we can advocate all we want, and we may not get what our child needs. So this is why ESSA is important to your child. It is a general education law that applies to all students. So how we're always saying our children are general education students first, well, this is where that is in the law. This is a law that applies to all students, and our kids are a special focus as part of this law, because it started as a civil rights law. Its original focus was on students of color, but then as we started getting more English language learners, and remember, this predated even when our kids were allowed in school, and when our kids started going to school, then it started expanding its focus on certain subgroups, including students with disabilities. It raises the bar for free, appropriate public education under IDEA, because we all know that that appropriate word has come to mean, through court cases, something very de minimis, you know, some benefit. But ESSA says a high-quality education, and that's for all kids. So, you know, advocates for disabilities and the lawyers who represent them will say in court cases, well, you know, you say appropriate, what does appropriate mean? ESSA also applies to these kids, so appropriate must mean access to a high-quality education. So it creates an argument to raise the bar for what appropriate means. It also pushes systems change, because although IDEA is more about the individual child in that, you know, you've got your IEP and you've got your due process rights, ESSA tells states and districts and schools, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and if these students are not meeting the standards, then something needs to happen, and you need to address that at the school and district level. And when there's that kind of focus on specific subgroups, including students with disabilities, then that can push the system, and then things start becoming more available for you to advocate for. And my son, being 24, he was in the school system under IDEA before No Child Left Behind. And that was a big distinction, because this ESEA, before it was reauthorized as No Child Left Behind, it looked at general accountability at schools, but it just looked at, did the schools do well in general? they didn't really take a focus on, okay, the school may do well in general, but maybe the kids of color or the kids who have disabilities are not doing so well, and maybe that school needs to do something to fix things for them. And when No Child Left Behind came into being, that was the first time there was actually a focus where it said, we are not just looking at accountability in terms of all the students at your school. Yes, that's important, and we will look at that, but we are also going to separately look at how are your kids with disabilities doing? How are your students of color doing? How are your kids who are poor doing? How are your English language learners doing? And that made a really big difference in terms of putting a focus on our kids. So if implementation is strong for ESSA, it can enhance implementation of IDEA, but only if the system is being pushed to do what is right through ESSA. So before No Child Left Behind, we have a saying we use, what isn't counted doesn't count. So before No Child Left Behind, as I said, they didn't have any separate data for kids with disabilities. It was just all, how's everybody at the school doing? So there was no achievement data collected for our kids. They took assessments, but nowhere was it collected how they did. Principals, educators, parents had no idea how the students performed against the state academic content standards at all. And I know this because I was on a county committee where we were trying to look at data and find out how are kids with disabilities doing and set, continuous performance indicators for them. But there was no data, and none of the principals or even special ed teachers at the school could tell us how these kids were doing. This was in 1999. And then in 2002, after No Child Left Behind, all of a sudden schools were expected to collect data and what's called disaggregate, separate out the data for kids with disabilities so we could see how they were doing, and it counted in the accountability system. They couldn't meet what was called adequate yearly progress, the school or the district or the state, if their students with disabilities were not meeting standards. It wasn't enough that all kids in general were meeting standards. So this is really critically important in terms of what's happening now in ESSA and why your advocacy is so important. The school improvement plans, as a result, did not include strategies targeted at students with disabilities. They would say, oh, reading levels for kids in the school in general aren't good, so we're going to do this reading program. Well, half the time these reading programs were not being done in special ed classes, and back then certainly pretty much everybody was in a special ed class if they had a disability, so nothing was really being done to improve achievement. Alternate assessments that were given at the time were not based on the grade level content at all, and that's very important because even though your child may have their modifications and they may have their individualized education program, it is still supposed to be linked in some fashion to that grade level content. Otherwise, inclusion, for example, won't work, because if your child is working on completely different things with no link whatsoever to what's happening for other students, that's not going to work very well. That doesn't mean it can't be modified or adapted, but there needs to be some connection to what's going on with everybody else. And also, before No Child Left Behind, there were no highly qualified teacher requirements, and so no content knowledge was really required for special educators. As long as they had new special ed strategies, they didn't necessarily have to know the academic content, which was a big problem. So we do not want to go backwards, and that is what really the whole point of this presentation is, to keep from going backwards. So we have good news and bad news in ESSA. The good news is that NDSC was able to get some important provisions added to the section of ESSA that governs alternate assessments in particular. So kids with significant cognitive disabilities benefited more than any other group of kids with disabilities in this law because of these provisions, and they are the provisions that are in the slides later in this presentation that have to do with how you can use ESSA and IDEA for your IEP. And we may or may not get to that part of the actual presentation, but I wanted to provide the links to the documents that I have developed as well as those slides for your use. But those are very important, and those won't change. Those are required. The problem is that if ESSA implementation is not strong, if no one's looking at how kids with disabilities in your school are doing, then whether or not they do the things they're supposed to do that we got in this bill, like that they can't be precluded from working towards a regular diploma, or that states have to promote progress, not just access, but progress to the general ed curriculum, and that they're supposed to be able to come out of school and be able to pursue post-secondary and employment. All those things that were never in there before, if no one's watching what's happening because the whole implementation and accountability is not strong, then how well will these provisions that they're supposed to be doing actually be implemented? So that's a real important point about why state advocacy is also important. And so the bad news is that unprecedented discretion has been given to the states. We fought to try to get more accountability in the actual bill. Like No Child Left Behind had a lot of accountability in the bill. If your school did not meet adequate yearly progress for all kids, but also for kids with disabilities, there were some very specific things that they were required to do. Unfortunately, that caused a lot of backlash, and so people would be crying out that it's too prescriptive, it's not leaving things up to the state and the locals, and that was true to some extent. But the problem is, with kids with disabilities, traditionally, historically, kids with disabilities have not gotten the education they deserve. States have not made them a priority. They have had low expectations for them. So it's very concerning that there's so much discretion in the ESSA at your state level. And we know this is still a problem because when all the states got their waivers under the No Child Left Behind Act a few years ago, they did a number of things which really weakened accountability for kids with disabilities. So we know this isn't ancient history. We know even recently that states are not necessarily holding their schools accountable well for our kids. So your advocacy really is important here. There are also numerous provisions in the bill that limit the U.S. Department of Education's authority regarding ESSA implementation specifically. So it's going to be harder than ever for the federal Department of Education to say, oh, this isn't right and you need to do X, Y, and Z. So just to give you an idea of timelines and effective dates, most of the provisions were effective starting in August 2016. So those provisions later in the PowerPoint about the IEP that can be used with the IEP, those things are now in effect. The U.S. Department of Education in 2016 has been issuing regulations and guidance on ESSA. We have put out a number of alerts and asking parents to respond when there were proposed regulations to try to keep these as strong as possible. The stronger the federal regulations are, to try to shore up some of the weaknesses that are in the law in terms of implementation, the better off you are in terms of not having to fight so hard in your state. There's a lot of pressure on the U.S. Department of Education not to put anything in there that isn't specifically in the statute. So I don't know how those regulations will end up. We'll see as the next few months unfold. But I am very appreciative for the recent assessment regulations. There were actually quite a few families that submitted comments, and it was actually taken note today in EdWeek, which is the premier publication for education, and NDSC was actually called out for its comments and for the fact that parents were submitting comments, which is wonderful. That shows the importance of advocacy. And states during 2016 are transitioning to ESSA and working on their implementation plan, which will come into effect in 2017-18 when they'll start looking at schools based on their new rating systems under ESSA and determining which schools will get what is now being called targeted or comprehensive support and improvement. Those are the plans that schools will be required to have depending on how they're doing in terms of student achievement. And in the 2017-18 school year, that is when states and districts are supposed to start identifying these schools and requiring them to make these support and improvement plans. So, but the importance for right this minute is that your state is actively developing its plan right now. It's supposed to be taking input from all stakeholders, including people that represent students with disabilities. States are not doing a good job at that. In most states, there is no one representing students with disabilities on your state committees that are developing these plans. They're not really doing good outreach and letting groups know when there are stakeholder meetings, when there are opportunities for input. In Indiana, there is I have documents that show what's happening in every state, and there is precious little information available on the website that at least I can find about what is happening in your state, who's on the committee that's drafting your plan. And so these are some of the things that advocates need to push and find out about. So the differences, many of the differences in from No Child Left Behind to ESSA in terms of accountability, where they created more flexibility, where they gave this discretion more to the state, I have listed here. You know, flexibility is a word that states and school boards and teacher unions like to use that is a positive thing, they think. More flexibility for the local folks. And not that I'm against flexibility if used well, but it often ends up being a bad thing for our kids when there's flexibility. It often means lowered accountability, and that's what we have to watch out for. So some of the greater flexibility is in assessment design. It's in selecting and weighting indicators for accountability and participation rate. So in other words, your state can decide how much weight to give those state assessments, how much weight to give other indicators, and if the weight is not on indicators that are really important for student achievement and on our weaker indicators that don't translate into student achievement as much, then there's going to be weaker accountability. If they don't give much weight on whether or not our kids are participating in assessments and they can just encourage kids not to show up, you know, there's going to be weakened accountability for our kids. Identifying schools for improvement and support and what happens as a result. Your state will get to determine a lot of the rules around what schools will be identified for support and improvement. What needs to happen? How bad does it have to be and for how long before anything even happens for our kids? And for all kids in some cases. Teacher evaluations, there are no requirements anymore about tying teacher evaluations to the assessments except if ESSA funds are used for teacher evaluation. And a really big problem is that teacher qualification, effectiveness, and experience definitions are now up to the state. So highly qualified teachers, that whole requirement is gone now. So it is up to your state what kind of qualifications they are going to expect of teachers. And in the law, all it says is that they have to have a bachelor's degree. So it's quite possible your state could say anybody with any kind of bachelor's degree could be teaching special education, not even an education degree or a special education degree. I'm not saying that's what your state will do. I'm just saying that is possible. So how has NDSC been supporting strong ESSA implementation? We've been using our education policy expertise to keep expectations high and accountability strong to the extent we can, you know, weighing in on these regulations, asking for guidance, and pushing as hard as we can. But of course, we only get noticed to the extent that the families are behind us and pushing as well. We are trying to inform state advocates like you and families about what's going on federally and also in your states so that you can have a role in the process, which is part of what I'm doing here today. And also we're providing tools for use in state and local advocacy that I will talk about. So federal advocacy, very briefly on that. So what has happened is that there were a public comment period on ESSA accountability regulations. That period ended August 1st. We still have not heard what the final regulations will be. The public comment period on proposed ESSA assessment regulations just ended September 9th. That was the one that there were quite a few parents that sent in their comments to, which was so appreciated. There are proposed ESSA funding regulations that were just released, so there will be another comment period for the next 60 days, but it's already started to run, so a little less than that. This will be about supplement, not supplant. The Title I schools have to use their state and local dollars first. They can't just take federal dollars and just say, oh, we're not going to put any of our dollars in anymore. Use the Fed dollars and nothing there's no more money. Nothing gets improved. It's the same amount of money there always was. So that will be coming up. And then I give you the link where you can sign up for information and action alerts by joining the NDSC email list and liking the National Down Syndrome Congress Governmental Affairs Facebook page. There will be an alert going out in the next couple days with some sample comments that you can use in your state, but I'm providing you the link in this webinar. And also in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to take everything I did on ESSA and put it all in one newsline that will go out to families so that you can have everything all in one place. So state advocacy. So stakeholder involvement under ESSA. ESSA actually requires meaningful stakeholder consultation in the development of the draft ESSA plan and afterwards during a public comment period. So all along since last spring, your state should have been reaching out to all stakeholders, including families and including families who represent students with disabilities. The proposed regs specifically say representing civil rights groups and disability groups. But like I say, that hasn't been happening very much. I have not heard that it's happening in Indiana. If someone knows that it's been happening to any great level, that would be wonderful to know when we get to the question or comment period, because I'm not really seeing it. One of the important things for you all to find out is who is on the committee that's actually drafting your state plan and whether there's anybody representing the disability community, not just the special ed director, but somebody from the actual community, your protection and advocacy organization in your state, your developmental disabilities council, somebody like that, somebody from DS Indiana, which I know nobody's on there from. In my state, Maryland, there was nobody representing the disability community, and we had to write letters and push, and they finally did put someone on there representing our community. So parent involvement is essential to ensure your state uses its ESSA discretion wisely. This is also important for IDA, not just because this pushes the system and will help push the system in a way that also helps with IDEA, but you also need to really strengthen your statewide coalitions with Down syndrome organizations, with other disabilities, even with other communities like students of color, because when we get to IDEA, this is going to be a problem again. We're going to have to fight to make sure that everything isn't just left up to the state, that there are still requirements that we can hold on to and fight with in IDEA. And the stronger the statewide coalitions we have, the better chance we have at the federal and at the state level for that. So ESSA plan, this is Indiana's specific information, dates for the statewide input meetings, which are coming up now, September 14th to October 12th, and September 14th is in Indianapolis. So people should sign up and go. And member lists for the ESSA advisory committees are listed at this information. So at this link. So any information there is up at this link, and you can look and see who are representing the committee, on that committee, and see if there's anybody maybe you recognize that I don't, who might be representing the disability community. But it is important to get out to these stakeholder meetings across the state. The Superintendent Accountability Advisory Committee includes someone named Lisa Kovacs, who is a parent of a child with a disability. I looked her up this morning, the other day, and found out that her advocacy focus has been on students who are deaf and hard of hearing. That's not to say that she won't represent students with disabilities in general well. I just don't know her. And so it might be good to reach out to her, to find her somewhere, and to see if you can get input with her, because if she represents disability, then fully, then she should be taking your comments to this group. And there are also online written public comment webpage that I give you the link to, and also your ESSA contact person in your state. So this is your specific information, and I am going to talk in a moment about sample comments that I drafted that you can use, cut and paste, whatever you're comfortable with, and submit to the state through either directly to this Danielle Shockey or through this online written public comment webpage, and be telling them these are the specific things we want you to do in Indiana. So keep accountability strong. So here are some of the tools for families. The first one is a link to the sample comments that I just told you about. They are already online. There will be an alert going out in the next day or two in general, but this is a link to those comments directly for you. Earlier, I had also done these NBSC talking points for general stakeholder input, where I got into some of the recommendations, but also tried to explain what some of the subject matter is in the sample comments. They tell your state you need a minimum subgroup size of this, but it doesn't really explain to you what minimum subgroup size is. I will try to explain some of those things in this webinar, but this talking points document has more explanation. Also, there is an NDSC State Plan Advocacy Guide, which is for people who want even greater detail about the state plan development issues and advocacy. There are links to studies, much more detail, depending on how deep you want to go to learn about this. Some parents might just want to cut and paste and send. Others might want to learn more about the underlying information. That is up to you, but I hope everybody will at least send some comments in and bring them with you, and when you go to these meetings, and if there's an opportunity to talk to people, share that information. So key state plan accountability issues. The first of these, and I'll tell you why it's actually the most important of all, is the minimum subgroup size. This is also referred to as N size, the letter N size. It's a statistical term. This impacts whether schools are accountable for students with disabilities or any of the subgroups that are a focus here. And what this means is that your state gets to set this minimum subgroup size. And right now, Indiana has a minimum subgroup size of 30 for accountability purposes, so for determining, whether your schools need improvement or not. They use a minimum subgroup size of 10 for reporting data. So if your school, just say you're an elementary school, and they only test kids for state purposes in grades 3 through 5. I don't know if your elementary schools go to 6 or 5 or 4, but just say they go to 5. And if your minimum subgroup size in your state continues to be 30, then if you have 29 kids with disabilities in your school that are assessed in general, then they do not have to count those kids separately in the accountability system. So how poorly those kids do will not matter in terms of whether your school is identified for supports and improvements. That's a big deal. Now, your state also has an N size of 10 for reporting. That's a good thing, because at least they will report the data if they had 29 kids. They only don't report the data for students with disabilities in your school report card if it would be 9. So that's what that means. I hope that's clear, and you can ask questions in a little bit about that. But what we're saying as national advocates is that this number, this 30 number, should be closer to 10 or lower, because there are a number of states that already have a much lower number than that. There are 13 states that have 10 or fewer for accountability and for reporting purposes. Your state, in using 10 for reporting, has already admitted that you don't need to have 30 for confidentiality purposes, or otherwise they wouldn't be reporting the data with groups that are, between 10 and 30. But the other reason they have that they say they need 30 is they say for statistical reliability, like whether or not this data is going to really represent what it's supposed to represent. And they'll argue that, well, when it's under 30, it's not representative, it doesn't have statistical reliability. But I would definitely question that, in that there are already a lot of states that have this minimum subgroup size 10 or fewer. My state of Maryland has 5. So how are these other states managing to have statistical reliability? Now, why is a minimum subgroup size of 30 for accountability a problem? Because across the country, I don't have the data for Indiana specifically, except for from quite a while ago. But across the country, and even in Indiana's older data, when you have a minimum subgroup size of 30, then at least 20%, and in smaller schools like elementary schools, 30% of schools do not have to be held accountable for their students with disabilities. That is huge. So when they look at schools for whether or not they need those supports and improvements, they will not look at whether your school has consistently underperforming subgroup and they need supports and improvement. So, and those supports and improvement, those strategies are what will move your school forward in improving things for that subgroup of students with disabilities, and is very important. So that's why minimum subgroup size is so important, because some of these other things I will now talk about won't even happen. If they keep the 30 and your school only has 29 kids that are assessed with disabilities, none of these other things will even be looked at for your school. And that's why that one is so important, that minimum subgroup size or N size. So definition of consistent, and I should point out that in that sample comments, I get specific where I say about it should be 10. And there are studies, or lower, and there are studies, national studies, that support that. Definition of consistently underperforming subgroups impacts whether a school will be identified for targeted support and improvement. So the law says if there are consistently underperforming subgroups in a school, then your state needs to identify the school for targeted support and improvement. But your state gets to define what does consistently mean and what does underperforming mean. So those terms become very important in how they're defined. Now, the proposed regulations define consistently as no more than 2 years. Whether or not that's going to end up in the final regulations, I don't know. But if it's no more than 2 years, that means at least those students can't be underperforming for 5 years before anyone has to do anything about it, unless, of course, there are not enough kids to meet that subgroup size rule. So consistently should be no more than 2 years that they have to be underperforming before something happens. Underperforming is also up for definition, and the federal regulations are not going to be very specific about what your state has to do to define this term. And what advocacy groups are saying, what our sample comments say, is that states have to set goals and interim measures for how kids are supposed to do. And if the kids with disabilities are not meeting those goals, then that should be what consistently underperforming means. And it shouldn't have to be compared to some other group, because maybe the other groups are also underperforming. It should be specifically on our kids with disabilities in your school meeting those goals and interim measures that the state is setting. And if they're not, then they're underperforming. If it hasn't happened for 2 years in a row, then they're consistently underperforming, and that school should be identified for targeted support and improvement. So there are 2 layers of support and improvement. One is targeted, and that's for schools that have these consistently underperforming subgroups or have what's called low-performing subgroups, which are subgroups of kids with disabilities that are performing so low that they are as low as the lowest 5% of schools in your state. You know, our kids shouldn't have to perform that low before they get attention on what they need. Now, the comprehensive support and improvement category comes with a lot more money than targeted support and improvement, and a lot more focus and state intervention and attention. So if our kids are in a school that's identified for targeted support and improvement because they have consistently underperforming subgroup, but nothing is getting better after a period, we would want our kids to be that school identified for comprehensive support and improvement. But in the law, there is no mechanism for moving schools that were identified for consistently underperforming subgroups from targeted to comprehensive support and improvement. However, the federal law does allow states to add more categories to what kinds of schools will get comprehensive support and improvement. So in our sample comments, we argue that after 3 years of being targeted for support and improvement, if the school still has consistently underperforming subgroups, that they should move to comprehensive support and improvement. Because realize, even if consistently is defined as 2 years, and then 3 years of target support and improvement, that will already be 5 years that that subgroup will not have improved and will still be in need of improvement. And they certainly should get kicked up to some more intensive support and improvement and more funding to provide it. And that's why we make an issue of this comprehensive support improvement and broadening the categories to include those schools. Indicators of school quality impact the focus on academic achievement. So the federal government requires certain indicators, which are in the documents and tools we've provided. I explain this in those talking point documents and in the state advocacy plan documents. And there are 4 academic achievement indicators that are required, but your state can pick other softer indicators of school quality or effectiveness, and the concern is that they will pick these softer measures that may not amount to real changes in achievement, and they will give them a lot of weight, and the other achievement indicators will get washed away. So it's very important to put a lot of focus on those achievement indicators. And again, all this is explained in greater detail in the tools that I have provided. So key state plan assessment issues. So there are some assessment issues specifically related to students who take an alternate assessment. The new law limits the percent of kids who are assessed who can take an alternate assessment to 1% of all those students. So that's a difference. There didn't used to be a cap on the percent that can take the assessment. It used to be on the percent of proficient scores that can be used for accountability, but not on who takes it. So that puts a little pressure on your state in terms of wanting to make sure that your districts and schools are not overusing that alternate assessment inappropriately. So that's a good thing. And so this is one of the issues. And again, there are recommendations in the sample comments that you can cut and paste that will say they need to have strategies in that state plan for making sure they don't go over this 1%. Also, there are recommendations in that document that there should be training on state guidelines for alternate assessment participation, because a lot of times, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, when you have IEP meetings and you're supposed to be told what are the criteria for determining if your child takes an alternate assessment, most parents have never seen that criteria, and the IEP team is not trained well on what those criteria are. And it's also very important that they make sure, the state makes sure that there is this guidance, and that not just educators but also parents know what is in there so that they can participate in this decision, and that should be in their state plan. The definition of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. These are the students that take alternate assessments. The state is allowed to define who those kids are. The federal regulations, the proposed regulations, did put certain parameters in there, but they're not as tight as they could be. So NDSE is recommending in their sample comments that you can use that the state's definition of who these kids are should not be based on IQ points. They should not be based on what disability category, that if your student is in the ID, intellectual disability category, or that they have Down syndrome, or if they are in a special ed classroom. That these things should not be determining whether a student takes an alternate assessment. It should be based on the level of supports and interventions and direct instruction and modifications that they need in order to make progress in the grade level curriculum. And that should be really the only factor. And also it's important that that definition say that students must have instruction in enrolled grade content before it is determined whether the student is a student with the most significant cognitive disabilities, because how can you determine whether or not the student has that level of disability if you haven't tried to see if they can learn the subject matter and you're just basing it on, like I said, IQ or disability category, and not in exactly what kind of supports they need to work on enrolled grade content. And again, when I say enrolled grade content, I mean, with the adaptations and modifications they may need and what level that may be. And there are also some key state plan issues regarding teachers and students. So your state gets to define, what does effective teacher mean? What does experienced teacher mean? What does a qualified teacher mean? And they have to keep data about this for students to see whether or not there is equity in who are getting the more effective, experienced, and qualified teachers. One issue in the law is that they tend to focus a lot on students of color and in poverty for this equity, and that's very important. But it's also important that kids with disabilities get effective, experienced, and qualified teachers. So that's one of the recommendations in those sample comments. And also there's recommendations for how these different terms should be defined as well. And also strategies to support all students. That's another part of your state plan. And this impacts low achievement. And there is language in there about reducing activities, for example, that have to do with aversive behavioral interventions, overuse of suspension and expulsion. These are things that your state plan is required to describe. So that's good, but you want to make sure they understand in that plan that they're talking about restraints and seclusion for kids when they talk about aversive interventions that need to be reduced. It doesn't say anything about reducing segregated classes and schools or lack of accessible instruction, but you can certainly make an argument that those things need to happen in order for all students to be successful. And this is where you could request that there's language about universal design for learning and for activities to help reduce the numbers of students, especially in certain disability categories like intellectual disability, that are in separate classes. Because for kids who take alternate assessments, for example, nationwide, 93% of those students are in separate classes. And even though I know there are families that would rather have their kids in separate classes, there should be more than 7% that are included. So, I mean, clearly that's a discrimination issue that needs to be worked on. So when you do this advocacy, we also hope that you will involve self-advocates. They can participate in IEP meetings, obviously, and if interested in local, state, and federal advocacy efforts, there are ways that you can help them write something that would be in their words that would support what you're doing. Often when I brought my son to advocate at a state or local level, I would see what in it made sense to him that he was interested in, that he could say, and if he was willing to also support what I was saying, so that they would know that he stood behind the things I was saying as well. There can be PowerPoint presentations or written documents that can be used by all self-advocates. They can hand in a written document, whether or not they can read it or have oral communication ability. So there are lots of ways to help to involve self-advocates. And helping your children understand their options for post-secondary education employment from a young age will help with their goal setting on IEPs. So the more they learn about this, even in the most simplistic ways, the more it will help them as they get older. So that primarily what I've gone through so far is the state advocacy. I know it's very dense and complicated. When you look at the sample comments, I think you'll see it's very simple that you could just cut and paste if you want to and just submit these comments. And there is more information in the other documents for those who want to get deeper. But at this point, I'd like to ask questions on all the state advocacy material.
So, Ricki, we had a question. Does the Every Student Succeeds Act only apply to public schools?
It primarily applies to public schools, yes. I mean, there are some provisions in there if private schools are getting some federal funding, but primarily it is for public schools, yes. And charter, some charter schools are public schools as well. and some states, and Indiana used to do this, and I don't know what they're planning to do, they have different rules for what Title I schools have to do versus other schools. In a lot of states, they have the same accountability requirements regardless of whether you're a Title I or a non-Title I school, so that's an issue specific to Indiana.
Great, thank you. So if anybody has questions that you'd like for Ricki to ask, if you want to type it, there's like a question and answer pane. If you want to type it in there, you can. We'll give you a minute if you are thinking of anything.
And I really encourage you to ask the questions because, you know, this is where you get to feel more comfortable with this and be able to advocate. So, and I can't tell in a webinar if you all look really confused or like whether I've made sense or not. So.
Okay. I'm not getting any additional questions. So it's 1:50. Now, Ricki, did you have more material?
I can get into some of the, well, and I'm hoping that people are not failing to ask questions because they want to get to the IEP information because this is really important, the state advocacy piece. So,
Okay.
but I can go on if you wish me to.
Okay. Yep. You know what? We had one question come through.
Yeah.
Looking at page 9, does Indiana allow for diplomas with alternative assessments? Good question, Sarah.
Well, I don't think currently they do, although I'm not an expert on Indiana, to be honest with you. I know that there are people that were trying to get that to happen. I don't know that that actually happened, but that does bring up something else in ESSA that I can mention. And that's that in the law, they have a provision in there that they never had before that allows states, when they do their graduation rate calculations, to calculate in kids who took the alternate assessment, which we fought against because it's not right to count them as graduates with regular diplomas if they haven't actually earned a regular diploma. But what they did put in there, which is better than what they were going to put in there, is that they have to have a diploma, a special alternate diploma, if they're going to count them for such. And then there are requirements in the law that say that that alternate diploma has to be aligned to the regular diploma and the requirements for that diploma. It has to be standards-based. So that will encourage certain states to say, hey, we want to count our kids who take the alternate assessment as if they graduated with a regular diploma. So we're going to create this alternate assessment. You just want to be really certain that it is a high-quality alternate assessment, not just based on IEP goals, but based on the content that students are supposed to learn. And you also want to make sure that this isn't used to preclude your child from working towards a regular diploma, because ESSA does provide now, and a third of the states didn't do this before, but that states must allow your students, even if they are taking an alternate assessment, this doesn't say that they can't work towards a regular diploma. They may not earn a regular diploma in the end, depending on how much modification they need, but it's not this automatic take you off diploma track thing is no longer permitted. So, you know, you want to balance that. You know, there are some kids that maybe can earn a regular diploma. I don't know. But if they can, an alternate diploma, especially a good quality standards-based one, would be a nice alternative. But I don't know which states. No state has one that would qualify currently. I do not know, and this is a question to ask Indiana with, you know, that contact information I gave you, whether or not they're planning to look at that. I do not know that.
Great, thank you, Ricki. Well, I don't see any more questions up there, so if you want to go ahead and start talking about IEPs, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so I will continue, and, you know, for those who only have an hour, thank you for listening, but I will continue on with the rest of these slides then. So ESSA and IEP advocacy. We have two documents out there. One is the top 5 things to know about ESSA and IEP meetings, and it's very, very basic. And that's just a bullet of 5 points, and that's the link to that. And then there's also a link to a more detailed document that's about 8 pages long that gets into ESSA FAQs, frequently asked questions, and IEP tips. And so it explains more of the background. It gives you links to studies or, different things that might help you advocate, beyond just saying, well, this is what it says. It gives you more information for the arguments you may want to make on these points. So we already talked some about participation in the alternate assessment and the different rule now that only 1% can actually participate. And this puts pressure on states to give schools better guidance for IEP teams. So the tip, and I had mentioned this earlier, is request a copy of that state participation criteria before attending your IEP meeting. You shouldn't have to go into an IEP meeting and not know what is the basis on which the decision will be made whether your child is going to take an alternate assessment. Now, I don't want to make people feel like their child shouldn't be in the alternate assessment. In some states, using a good quality alternate assessment, and if your state is still using the NCSIC or what they call now multi-state alternate assessment, that is a good quality alternate assessment, but you want to make sure that is the right assessment for your child. And so you want to make sure you know what those are and whether your child is meeting them. The most important issue with the alternate assessment was that before they could take your child off the track automatically, and they used it to decide, put your kid in a separate class. And there needs to be training that the part of the LRE requirement is not whether or not your kid takes an alternate assessment. That should not be a determining factor in where your child is placed. So enrolled grade state content standards. The statute now makes very clear that there's a difference between content standards, which is what your child is supposed to be taught in the classroom, and achievement standards, which is how much of that are they expected to know to be proficient. So if they've got geometry, just say, that is part of the grade level curriculum, to what level is your child supposed to know geometry? If they're in a grade where geometry is taught, your child should be learning geometry. But what about geometry? It shouldn't be just that the bed is rectangle shaped, which some states, look at in their alternate assessment. It should be some real geometry, but it might be using, 1-inch blocks for one-to-one correspondence to figure out what volume is. It might be something more that looks like geometry for everybody else. And so what are those achievement standards? How much are they expected to learn? But it should be aligned with the same content that everybody else is taught. If it's geometry, then it should be geometry. If they are learning prerequisite skills like addition, that could be worked at as part of geometry. But it needs to look like what other kids are learning, because otherwise there is no real way to include them. The tip is that all students are required to have instruction based on the enrolled state content standards. Not all schools and classes are doing that. There is a lot of confusion by teachers about the difference between an alternate achievement standard and the content standards. The alternate achievement standard is how much they're expected to know, but the content standards are still the grade level content standards. And there's a great brief at this link about the difference between the two. And there is also an OSEP guidance document that says that our kids are supposed to be taught on grade level material. Progress in the general ed curriculum. No Child Left Behind. This is one place that ESSA is better for our kids. That I've been trying to fix this for all these years, and we finally got this fixed. That the regulations under No Child Left Behind required states to promote access to the general education curriculum to the extent possible. That is such a weak standard, it didn't even meet IDA as far as I was concerned. Whereas ESSA now says the states have to promote involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. That is a lot higher standard. So when you talk about at the IEPT meeting whether all the services and supports are in place, the goal should be to enable your child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. And some of that may involve, are they using universal design for learning? if your child needs certain supplementary aids and services, the goal should be promoting involvement and progress in the general education curriculum, not just access. Pursuit of post-secondary education or employment. Something new in ESSA that's very important is that it says that proficiency on an alternate assessment, what that's supposed to mean is that the student has the skills and knowledge to be on track to pursue post-secondary education or competitive integrated employment. It actually refers to an act called WIOA, and that WIOA Act is about competitive integrated employment. And what competitive integrated employment means is that they should be making a competitive wage, above, minimum wage or above, the same wage that other people who have that job would make, and they should be in integrated employment where they work alongside other people who do not have disabilities. So that is what it's supposed to mean for your child to be proficient on alternate academic achievement standards. If they're taking the general assessment, then certainly there's been language in there for years about college and career readiness. But this is new that they really focus on this for the kids in the alternate assessment. So the tip is to use this provision to start an IEP team conversation about the ways in which the IEP should be preparing your child for these goals. And I mean as young as possible, because there are lots of ways, and especially around independence and other things, that even very young children, you can start looking ahead to what kind of skills do they need so that they will be ready to go to post-secondary education and or be in competitive integrated employment. And there is this kind of learned dependence that a lot of times happens in special education, and we want to see whatever accommodations there are and whatever support is given, that it be done in ways to make a child as independent as possible, and then, back off the level of support needed by a person to help them. And I even had asked for my son's grading system that even if he got the same grade all year long, in terms of what he was expected to learn, if they could indicate to me with what level of independence, so that I could see that at least, even if he got the same grade, he was doing that more independently, that would help him be out there in the world, which he is, actually living in his own apartment, has an internship at NIH, going on the buses, just starts at a very early age to work towards that. The opportunity to work towards a regular diploma. As I said earlier, under No Child Left Behind, a third of states automatically took students who take an alternate diploma off diploma track. They couldn't even try to work towards a diploma. It was a foregone conclusion they would never earn one. Now ESSA says the states cannot preclude these students from attempting to earn the regular high school diploma. Now, what will happen, I'm guessing, but I'm pretty good at guessing, that states are going to say, or your school's going to say, well, your student needs so many modifications that there's no way they're going to earn a diploma. Well, by definition, students who take an alternate assessment need modifications. So just the fact that they need modifications should not mean they can't stay on diploma track, or what is the point of having a requirement in the law that students who take alternate assessments can't be precluded from attempting to earn the regular diploma. If they get to age 21 and they haven't met the requirements, then they won't earn a diploma. But why do we have to take them off diploma track, decide they can't have a chance, even if they have a lot of modifications? They also have 3 more years to earn a regular diploma. And in my experience, the longer they're on diploma track, the more they learn academically, the better their chances are of learning more, even if they never do earn that diploma. And so, this is one of those things you'll have to battle about, the modifications and at what point they think your kids should be off diploma track. I also personally, as a parent, would argue that they shouldn't have to do every single thing the other children do without modifications just to be on diploma track. Because again, this language says kids in alternate assessments can't be precluded from attempting to earn the diploma. By definition, they need modifications. So that should be permitted. And this is going to be a very new way for schools to think. And this provision can also be used to support inclusion. Two of the biggest arguments against inclusion, one of the biggest arguments, is that they're not on diploma track, so therefore they can't be included, which is a bogus argument. It has nothing to do with LRE, but it is one that is used. I did describe this new alternate diploma provision where they have to, if they want to count the kids who take alternate assessments as if they graduated with a regular diploma for graduation rate, that they have to get this special state-defined alternate diploma. It's got to meet these requirements that I described. And so we want to make sure, though, that it's not used to push the kid off diploma track unless it's clear that a regular diploma really isn't an option. And also another important thing that I actually didn't put in here but want to make a point about, IDA services end when your child gets a regular diploma. So, you know, most kids will wait till they're 21 to get that regular diploma. This thing about counting your kid as if they got a regular diploma, that does not count to push your kid off IDA services. It's only when they actually get a real regular diploma. So that's an important fact as well. Education in the LRE. ESSA doesn't mention LRE or inclusion. IDA doesn't mention inclusion. It talks about the least restrictive environment, and in IDA there is a presumption that that setting will be that regular class for all students with disabilities unless they cannot make satisfactory, you know, they can't get a satisfactory education even with supplementary aids and services. We know this is not well implemented, and so we need all the help we can get to push this. So the fact that the state must promote involvement in and progress in the general education curriculum for all students based on the state content standards under ESSA can help promote inclusion, because when your state likes to say, your IEP team likes to say, well, that your kid's on a different curriculum. Your kid is not on a different curriculum. There's only one curriculum under IDA, and that's the general education curriculum. ESSA backs that up by saying that kids in the alternate assessment, they still have to have involvement in and progress in the general ed curriculum. It's still based on state content standards. So that argument for them not being included is, again, bogus. And it's bogus anyway, even before this language in the ESSA, because there is a regulation, which I post all the time about, that says that needed modifications are not a reason to remove a child from the regular education classroom. So there are lots of bogus arguments being used, but this language in the ESSA can help bolster your fight if that's what you think is appropriate for your child. Also, all students must be given the opportunity to complete requirements for high school diploma. As I mentioned earlier, one of the bogus arguments that are used very often is that your child's on a diploma track, therefore they can't be in this classroom for whatever reason. So accommodations. ESSA encourages the development and dissemination of accommodations to help more students take the general assessment. So it's trying to encourage that students get off the alternate assessment and take the general education general assessment if possible, if with accommodations they can do that. But, you know, maybe more accommodations need to be developed to make that possible. There's also language that provides grants for professional development on the use of accommodations in instruction and assessment, something that a lot of times educational teams are not as aware of as they should be. I've had a lot of parents in states that are using PARCC assessment, you know, say that their team said that they couldn't have this accommodation when the PARCC accommodation manual says they can. So there needs to be more training around that to make sure that kids are getting all the accommodations that they can get. And to prepare for IEP meetings, a tip is to request a copy of the accommodations policies for yourself and see, you know, is your child being offered the accommodations that they should be. And again, I say in advance for an IEP meeting, because it's very hard when they have you there in that meeting, you know, to be figuring the things out when they haven't given you the information at all, or they're thrusting at you at that meeting. And if you haven't been given the information ahead of time and they're trying to thrust a bunch of information at you there, I would ask to come back and continue the IEP meeting, because, you know, you need to be well informed so that you can participate. And universal design for learning. I hope you know what universal design for learning is. It's been something definitely I've been pushing for a long time. There are resources at udlcenter.org if you've never heard of it. It is clearly recognized in ESSA as an accepted best practice to ensure that multiple means of representing information, multiple means of students learning and showing what they know, and multiple means of engagement are used by school districts and schools. And when I say school districts, I mean this should be permitted in their curriculum, when they pick resources and materials and books, that they should have other options available that students can use to help them understand what's being taught. So there is more information in the NDSC ESSA FAQ and TIPS document, which I already gave you a link for. And also your schools and teachers can have a UDL professional learning community or community of practice by going to these links. And even if your district or state is not moving on this, these are some things that can be done right at your local level by people who are interested.
We did get a comment. Very helpful. Your presentation was very helpful. It was really great. And I just want to reiterate again that the webinar will be available soon. DSI will send it out. Down Syndrome Affiliates in Action will make it available, and Ricki Sabia and the National Down Syndrome Congress will also make it available. So who wanted to know how they can best advocate for their daughter who's in a private elementary school?
Well, you know, I think a lot of the advocacy is around the same principles. The problem is in a private school that you don't have the same rights that you do federally, you know, under law as you do in the public schools. So you can use the principles that are behind these arguments, and you can use some of the studies that may be mentioned. As far as the actual law is concerned, it's a little harder, but certainly the fact that our federal government has decided these things are important for students should be an argument, and even if they're not legally bound, I would argue that they're morally bound, especially if it's a religious school, to do these things for students, to make sure they have access and that they are making progress. And, you know, I would hope certainly a private school that accepts students with disabilities would be wanting to do all they can do to move things forward for those students. I would say especially the information around universal design for learning is applicable to anybody, and that information is very useful. I am a good friend of somebody who is very involved in Catholic school inclusion here in my state, and they do presentations on universal design for learning, and you know, and that's important. That can be used by anybody in whatever school or classroom. So that would be probably one of the biggest things, is to make sure they're aware of that and can use that. And that just doesn't, that's not just for kids with disabilities. That's to increase both enrichment and support for all students, including gifted students and students with disabilities. If you're flexible and you're using multiple means of engagement, multiple means of presenting information and learning and letting kids show what they know, then your kids are able to reach their level. And my son was actually in honors class, some honors classes in high school, and because it had to be modified anyway, so why not, right? But using universal design for learning, they were able to teach a regular class lesson, not pull them aside, but in a regular class lesson, be teaching the lesson in a way that was meaningful to the most gifted students, as well as bringing him in as part of whole group lessons. And so that would be my biggest recommendation, UDL.
Thank you, Ricki. Do you have anything else?
No, I just really encourage you to advocate in your state, but you know, this is going to happen quickly. The states are probably going to be finishing up their process by the end of the year and putting a draft plan out. By the time the draft plan gets out, it will give you maybe 30 days to review it, which is going to be very complicated and hard to do. And God knows if you'll find out about when they do. I would encourage Down syndrome Indiana to go out there and talk to the State Department of Education, make sure that they let you know when that draft plan is out there and any other stakeholder opportunities so that you can engage with that. But the biggest opportunity for change is before that plan is actually drafted. So these meetings in your state, to get out there, to hand in your written comments, to make some oral comments if you can, at the very least to submit written comments to your State Department of Education. That can make a really big difference. I mean, people noticed. There was an Ed Week article I posted today on the Down Syndrome Governmental Affairs Facebook page where the premier, like I said earlier, I think I might have mentioned this, that the premier publication for education in the country took note that parents of children with Down syndrome were commenting on the regulations. So, that means more in a lot of ways. I mean, I can go out there and say this for an organization and say I'm speaking on your behalf, but having you all get out there and comment, that means much more, especially in your state. So I hope the tools that were given to you are good enough and helpful enough, and please let me know if they're not, but hopefully they are and will help you be able to do that advocacy.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just put in the chat section, but the first listening tour for Indiana is scheduled in Indianapolis on September 14th at Decatur High School. The address is 5251 Kentucky Avenue. It's from 4:30 to 6:30, and there is a little bit of information on the Indiana Department of Education website. Ricki did have that link in her presentation. Down Syndrome Indiana will be there, and we will be following this. We will be commenting on it. I will do my best to keep you informed of whatever I know, but I would encourage everyone to attend a listening tour if possible.
Do you have a state coalition Facebook page?
No, but that's a great idea.
Because what I've done in other states that have a Down Syndrome Coalition is that when I see things come up about the state, articles that may be written or information I see, I can post it directly, onto your Facebook page if you make me a member. I can also help if I see things, because I'm on lists that I get certain information, I can post stuff up there for you as well. And that goes for, any state, although it's hard to cover all 50 states, but I will do my best, in any state that has a way for me to do that.
That's a great idea. I'll work on that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this information.
Thank you. Well, I think that is it for today. I want to thank all of the attendees. Again, we will make this available, and I believe that I have all of your email addresses so I can send out a link once we've got it. Thank you.
Thank you.